The Watchman Who Never Slept. Chapter 1: The Birth of a Detective. The story of Allan Pinkerton does not begin in the smoky alleys of Chicago nor the corridors of power in Washington, but in the humble weaving sheds of Glasgow, Scotland. Born in 1819, Allan was the son of a police sergeant whose sudden death left the family destitute. His mother worked tirelessly to raise her children, instilling in Allan the twin virtues of perseverance and integrity. Though opportunities for education were limited, Allan displayed an insatiable curiosity. He devoured pamphlets, newspapers, and borrowed books, often reading by candlelight long after others had gone to sleep. From the start, his life bore the stamp of quiet determination. In his early years, Allan learned the craft of a cooper, the ancient trade of barrel-making. His hands toughened by labor, his shoulders broadened by toil, he found pride in shaping wood into vessels that carried whiskey, salted fish, and grain across the seas. Yet even as he worked, Allan listened closely to conversations in taverns and markets. He had a knack for watching people, for noticing the twitch of an eye or the hesitation in a voice. Though he could not have named it then, this instinct was the foundation of what would later make him a detective. Scotland in the 1830s was restless with political reform. Secret societies and Chartist meetings filled back rooms, calling for greater rights for working men. Allan, idealistic and eager, joined these gatherings. He believed in fairness and justice, values that never left him. But his outspokenness attracted attention from authorities who had little patience for dissent. In 1842, fearing persecution and drawn by the promise of freedom, Allan and his young wife Joan boarded a ship for America. They landed in Chicago before moving north to Dundee, Illinois, a village surrounded by wild country and endless opportunity. It was here that chance set Allan upon the path of detective work. One evening in 1847, while searching for suitable timber along the Fox River, Allan stumbled upon a small camp hidden among the trees. Smoke curled from a fire, and men huddled around crude presses. As he crept closer, Allan realized he had discovered a counterfeiting ring. Their operation was sophisticated, producing false coins that threatened the young economy of Illinois. Rather than retreat, Allan quietly observed their movements. For days he returned, noting their patterns, counting their numbers, and collecting fragments of discarded paper and metal as evidence. At last, he reported his findings to the sheriff. Acting upon Allan's information, the authorities raided the camp, seizing presses, molds, and barrels of counterfeit coins. The counterfeiters were arrested, and Allan found himself hailed as a hero. More than that, he realized he possessed a rare gift, the courage to face danger, the patience to gather facts, and the instinct to untangle deception. Word spread quickly through Kane County, and soon Pinkerton was asked to assist in other matters: stolen livestock, missing persons, and fraudulent land sales. Unlike others who sought only reward, Allan pursued cases with a sense of duty. He believed crime was not merely an offense against property but an injury to the fabric of society. His methods were unusual for the time. He listened before he spoke, questioned without intimidation, and always relied upon evidence. Where others rushed to judgment, Allan watched carefully, noting details others overlooked: muddy footprints at a barn door, the smell of tobacco in a room where no pipe lay, the hesitation of a witness when asked a simple question. Slowly, his reputation grew. By 1849, Allan was appointed Chicago's first official detective. It was a city bustling with growth, filled with immigrants, traders, and fortune-seekers. But where opportunity flourished, so too did crime. Theft, fraud, and violence spread through the streets. To many, Chicago seemed a place on the verge of chaos, but Allan saw in it a grand challenge. With his plain Scottish speech and stern manner, he walked the neighborhoods by day and by night, speaking with laborers, merchants, and tavern keepers. He earned their trust, for he treated the humble with the same respect he gave the powerful. One of his earliest cases in Chicago revealed his distinctive style. A jeweler reported a series of burglaries, each executed with uncanny precision. Locks were picked, safes emptied, yet no signs of forced entry remained. Suspicion fell upon drifters and dock workers, but Allan thought otherwise. He studied the crime scenes, measuring distances, examining scratches invisible to most eyes. He concluded the thief was no outsider but someone with knowledge of the shop's inner workings. His suspicion turned to the jeweler's own apprentice, a boy of neat appearance and mild manners. Allan watched quietly, never revealing his hand, until one night he followed the youth to a warehouse where the stolen jewels lay hidden. When confronted, the boy broke down, confessing that gambling debts had driven him to betrayal. Such cases cemented Allan's reputation as a man who valued truth above appearances. He believed every lie left a crack, every scheme bore a weakness, and it was his task to find it. His work began attracting notice beyond Chicago. Railroad companies, plagued by theft and sabotage, sought his services. Banks asked for his counsel. Even local politicians, though sometimes wary of his independence, respected his results. Allan never forgot his humble beginnings, nor did he allow success to sway him into arrogance. He dressed plainly, spoke simply, and carried himself as a servant of justice rather than a master of men. In the evenings, Allan would sit with Joan in their modest home, speaking little of his cases but much of their children. He cherished family life, seeing in it the foundation of honesty and order. Yet he could not ignore the world beyond his doorstep. He sensed that America, young and restless, faced trials greater than counterfeiting or theft. He believed corruption and violence threatened the very idea of democracy. Perhaps it was this conviction that drove him tirelessly onward, through long nights and dangerous assignments. As the decade drew to a close, Allan stood on the threshold of a career that would shape history. He had begun as a cooper in Scotland, traveled as an immigrant, stumbled by chance upon crime, and emerged as a detective whose name was whispered with respect and sometimes with fear. The man who once fashioned barrels now fashioned justice, bound not by iron hoops but by truth. His agency was still to be formed, his great cases yet to unfold, but already Allan Pinkerton had discovered his calling. And in the calling lay the seed of legend. Chapter 2, The Counterfeiters' Web. The year was 1850, and Chicago had grown from a swampy frontier outpost into a sprawling city of commerce and vice. With the expansion of railroads and the constant flow of new immigrants, opportunities multiplied for both honest men and criminals. Among the most dangerous threats to the city's prosperity was counterfeiting. False banknotes and coins slipped into circulation like poison into a bloodstream, spreading distrust in commerce and crippling the fragile confidence of a young economy. Merchants were cheated, farmers duped, and banks drained of their reserves. For every honest dollar earned, a false one seemed to lie in wait. It was a crime that struck not only at pockets but at the very stability of the nation. Allan Pinkerton understood this better than most. His first brush with counterfeiters along the Fox River had revealed their cunning and persistence. Now, years later, he was called upon to dismantle an operation far more complex. Rumors swirled through taverns of flawless notes, indistinguishable from those printed by the U.S. Treasury itself. Farmers in rural Illinois complained that their earnings turned to worthless paper when they sought to deposit them. The city's merchants, wary and fearful, demanded protection. It was into this atmosphere of suspicion that Allan stepped with his usual calm resolve. His investigation began not in the city but in the countryside. Counterfeit bills had first appeared in small towns along the Illinois River, where farmers and traders were less likely to detect the fraud. Posing as a grain buyer, Allan mingled among locals, listening as they spoke of strangers passing through, men who bought horses with large bills and vanished before the ink was dry. A pattern emerged. The counterfeiters were using rural markets as testing grounds before releasing their notes into Chicago. Allan traced their trail to a man named Silas Cobb, a tavern keeper with a reputation for shady dealings. Cobb was known to extend credit too easily, then collect debts with brutal efficiency. Allan spent nights in Cobb's tavern, watching, drinking little but listening much. He noticed Cobb kept a locked strongbox behind the bar, and that travelers with no clear trade often disappeared into his back room. The more Allan observed, the clearer it became. Cobb was more than an innkeeper, he was a broker for counterfeit money. But Cobb was only a link in the chain. To destroy the counterfeiters, Allan needed the forgers themselves. Through weeks of patient observation, he learned of a man called Luther Longhand Briggs, a printer dismissed years earlier for his skill with engraving plates. Briggs, it was said, could carve an eagle so lifelike that its feathers seemed to ruffle in the wind. Cobb supplied distribution, but Briggs supplied art. Together, they wove a web that stretched across Illinois and beyond. Allan devised a plan that relied not on force but on deception. He sent word through trusted informants that he wished to purchase notes in bulk. Disguised as a dishonest banker willing to profit from false currency, he arranged a meeting with Cobb. The tavern keeper, greedy and overconfident, agreed. One stormy night Allan entered the back room of Cobb's tavern, carrying a satchel stuffed with worthless paper cut to resemble real bills. Cobb opened his strongbox, revealing stacks of counterfeit notes that gleamed in the lantern light. Allan examined them carefully, admiring their near perfection. The ink smelled fresh, the engraving sharp. Only a trained eye could detect the flaw, a faint unevenness in the border, where the plate had worn. "You'll find no better work west of the Alleghenies," Cobb boasted, his thick fingers drumming the table. Allan, feigning eagerness, asked to meet the engraver. Cobb hesitated, but greed overcame caution. Within a week, Allan was led blindfolded through wooded roads to a secluded cabin. There he met Luther Briggs. The man was tall and thin, his hair wild, his spectacles perched precariously on his nose. The cabin was filled with tools of his trade, copper plates, presses, bottles of ink, and stacks of unfinished notes. Briggs spoke little, but his pride in his work was evident. Allan praised the quality, masking his disgust. Every word, every glance, was committed to memory. He now knew the heart of the operation. Returning to Chicago, Allan gathered trusted deputies and informed the sheriff. But rather than storm the cabin at once, Allan urged patience. He wanted not only Briggs and Cobb but the entire network. Over the next month, he traced the counterfeiters' routes, following their couriers through small towns, mapping their distribution across 3 states. His diligence revealed an astonishing reach. Counterfeit notes flowed as far as St. Louis and Cincinnati. What seemed a local crime was in truth a regional conspiracy. At last the net was ready. On a cold March morning, Allan led a coordinated raid. Cobb's tavern was seized first, his strongbox confiscated. Cobb himself fought like a cornered animal, but Allan's men overpowered him. Simultaneously, deputies surrounded Briggs's cabin. The forger, realizing escape was impossible, attempted to burn his plates, but Allan burst through the door and dragged him away before the flames consumed the evidence. The plates, presses, and thousands of dollars in false notes were secured. The trial that followed was a sensation. Merchants crowded the courtroom, demanding justice. Briggs, defiant at first, crumbled under Allan's testimony and the weight of physical evidence. Cobb, ever the coward, attempted to shift blame but only sealed his guilt. Both men received long sentences, and their conviction restored confidence in Chicago's markets. Farmers and traders once again accepted bills without fear. For Allan, the victory was not in applause or headlines but in principle. He had struck at the heart of dishonesty with the weapons of patience and truth. In his journal he wrote, "Counterfeiting is the quietest of crimes, yet the deadliest. Its poison spreads unseen, until the whole of commerce is weakened." A detective's task is not only to catch the hand that strikes, but to heal the wound it leaves. The case brought Allan wider fame. Railroad directors, bankers, and government officials began to seek his counsel. His reputation as a relentless foe of fraud was established. Yet Allan remained humble, reminding his men that justice was not glory but service. The people must trust their money, he told them, or they cannot trust their country. As spring warmed Chicago, Allan walked the streets with renewed purpose. He knew counterfeiting would never vanish. Where there was greed, there would be crime. But so long as men like Cobb and Briggs rose, Allan Pinkerton would rise to meet them. The web of counterfeiters had been torn apart, but Allan sensed larger conspiracies ahead. And in his heart, he welcomed the challenge. Chapter 3: The Railroad Mysteries. By the mid-1850s, the railroad was the steel artery of America, pulsing with trade, expansion, and restless movement. From the railyards of Chicago to the river crossings of Ohio, locomotives hauled the wealth of a growing nation. But where money flowed, crime followed. Trains carried gold, payrolls, and valuable goods. They also carried thieves who learned to exploit every weakness in the system. To protect their interests, railroad directors turned to the one man whose reputation promised order where chaos threatened, Allan Pinkerton. Pinkerton's introduction to railroad security began with the Illinois Central, a line stretching hundreds of miles across prairie and woodland. Reports had reached company offices of missing cargo, barrels of flour vanishing between stations, crates of textiles disappearing before reaching their destination. At first, officials suspected clerical errors or carelessness. But the losses grew too frequent, too costly, to ignore. The name whispered as a solution was always the same, Pinkerton. Allan accepted the task with characteristic seriousness. He began by riding the trains himself, dressed as a common passenger. For days he observed conductors, porters, and freight handlers. He noted how tickets were collected, how goods were loaded and unloaded, and where guards grew lax. He noticed, too, that in small towns the line between railroad employee and local tavern patron blurred. A brakeman might share a drink with a farmer 1 hour and handle his freight the next. It was in these blurred lines, Allan knew, that crime thrived. His suspicions settled upon a freight foreman named Hiram Blaylock. Blaylock was genial, well-liked, and apparently trustworthy, but Allan noticed that shipments under his supervision were disproportionately subject to loss. When Allan asked simple questions, Blaylock's answers came too quickly, rehearsed as though prepared in advance. Rather than confront him outright, Allan devised a trap. He arranged for a shipment of barrels, outwardly filled with flour, but secretly marked and sealed. He followed the cargo's journey, noting every stop. When the train arrived in Cairo, 2 of the barrels were missing. Pinkerton wasted no time. He traced Blaylock's steps, discovering that the foreman had offloaded the barrels at a remote siding under cover of night. From there, accomplices carted them to a warehouse on the edge of town. When Allan and local deputies raided the warehouse, they found not flour but expensive textiles and tools stolen from earlier shipments. Blaylock, confronted with undeniable evidence, confessed to leading a ring of employees who had been pilfering cargo for months. The case electrified the railroad industry. For the first time, directors realized that theft was not the work of faceless outsiders but of men within their own ranks. Pinkerton's success earned him permanent employment with the Illinois Central as head of railroad security. It was a role that expanded rapidly, for word of his methods spread to other companies. Soon, Allan was known across the Midwest as the guardian of the rails. But theft was only one threat. Railroads faced sabotage from rival companies, disgruntled workers, and even political radicals. Pinkerton's next major challenge came when sections of track were found damaged near Springfield. Iron spikes had been pried loose, ties removed, and in some cases rails deliberately bent. Trains carrying hundreds of passengers risked catastrophe. The saboteurs struck repeatedly, always at night, always leaving behind confusion but no trace of their identity. Allan approached the matter not as an engineer but as a detective. He inspected the damage himself, crawling along splintered ties and bent rails with a lantern. He observed footprints in the mud, all of similar size and pattern. He noted the marks of heavy tools, left by hands unskilled in rail work. The saboteurs, he concluded, were not railroad men but outsiders. His inquiries led him to a disgruntled farmer named Elias Turner, whose land had been bisected by the tracks. Turner had sworn vengeance upon the railroad that split his fields in two. Pinkerton planted informants among Turner's acquaintances, instructing them to feign sympathy for his grievances. Before long, Turner boasted of his deeds, naming 2 accomplices who helped him wrench rails from the ground. Allan acted swiftly, arresting the men before they could cause another disaster. In court, the trio claimed they sought only to frighten the railroad, but the judge, mindful of the potential carnage, sentenced them harshly. As the railroad expanded, so did Pinkerton's responsibilities. Payroll trains carrying wages for hundreds of workers became prime targets. On one occasion, Allan received intelligence that bandits planned to rob a train near Decatur. Rather than simply reinforce the guard, Allan disguised himself as the paymaster. He boarded the train with a heavy satchel chained to his wrist. When the bandits attacked, expecting little resistance, Allan drew a revolver and fired warning shots into the air. His deputies, hidden among the passengers, sprang into action. The robbers, stunned and outnumbered, surrendered without bloodshed. The incident, widely reported in newspapers, cemented Pinkerton's image as both strategist and man of action. What set Allan apart was his methodical approach. He insisted upon careful record-keeping, developing dossiers on suspects, compiling notes on crimes, and maintaining files that could be consulted years later. This was new in America, where investigations often relied on memory or rumor. For Pinkerton, knowledge was the foundation of justice. He told his men, "We must see beyond the present crime. Every thief leaves behind a history, and every history holds the key to the next act." In these years, Pinkerton began assembling a cadre of loyal operatives. He trained them personally, teaching patience, observation, and the value of blending into their surroundings. He hired not only men but also women, recognizing that a woman could move unnoticed where a man might attract suspicion. This, too, was revolutionary. One of his earliest female operatives, Kate Warren, proved instrumental in cases that lay ahead. By the close of the decade, Allan Pinkerton's name was synonymous with railroad security. He had dismantled theft rings, captured saboteurs, and thwarted robberies. The directors of railroads regarded him as indispensable, and newspapers spoke of him as the railway guardian. Yet Allan himself saw these victories not as ends but as beginnings. For he sensed that America stood on the brink of greater turmoil. The railroad was more than steel and steam, it was the stage upon which the nation's future played. And where the nation's lifeblood flowed, Allan Pinkerton resolved to stand watch. His work on the rails prepared him for challenges far larger than stolen flour or sabotage ties. Storm clouds gathered on the horizon, political and violent, and Pinkerton knew the skills honed on the railroad would soon be tested in the service of the entire country. Chapter 4: The Murder at the Boarding House. In the bustling heart of Chicago, where brick buildings leaned against one another and narrow alleys echoed with wagon wheels, stood a boarding house run by Mrs. Abigail Turner. It was a respectable establishment by outward appearance, catering to traveling merchants, railroad clerks, and the occasional newly arrived immigrant. For years it had provided quiet shelter, its modest rooms filled with the hum of conversation and the clatter of supper dishes. But in the winter of 1856, its peace was shattered by a crime that startled even a city growing accustomed to violence, a murder behind closed doors. The victim was a man named Henry Wallace, a salesman of modest means. He had taken a room at Mrs. Turner's boarding house in early January, paying 2 weeks in advance. Described as friendly and soft-spoken, he shared meals with the other boarders and often lingered in the parlor to read newspapers aloud. On a snow-laden morning, however, Wallace was found dead in his room, slumped over his desk with a knife driven deep into his chest. His door had been locked from within, the single window nailed shut against the cold. The mystery was compounded by the absence of any sign of struggle. The scene was eerily calm, as though Wallace had simply lain down to rest, except for the crimson stain spreading across his waistcoat. The Chicago police, baffled by the locked-room circumstance, turned to Allan Pinkerton. By then his reputation as a detective extended far beyond counterfeiters and railroad thieves. He was known as a man who solved puzzles others abandoned. When Allan arrived at the boarding house, he approached with his usual methodical calm. He first studied the outside of the building, noting the placement of windows, the narrow alley that ran behind it, and the footprints pressed into the snow. Inside, he inspected the narrow hallway that led to Wallace's room, pausing to ask Mrs. Turner about the locks, the keys, and the habits of her boarders. The room itself was plain, a narrow bed, a writing desk, and a single chair. Papers lay scattered across the desk, smeared with ink from a toppled inkwell. The knife, lodged firmly in Wallace's chest, was of common make, the sort found in any kitchen. Allan bent low, his eyes tracing the floor. There was no sign of forced entry, no broken latch, no tampering with the lock. He examined the window, finding the nails undisturbed. If the killer had entered, it was not through brute force. Pinkerton turned to the body. The angle of the wound suggested it had been delivered from the front, with precision rather than frenzy. Wallace's face bore no terror, only a faint expression of surprise. On his fingers, Allan noticed smudges of soot, unusual in a man who worked with paper. In the grate lay ashes not of wood but of burned paper, still warm. Someone had destroyed documents before or after the murder. Questioning the boarders yielded fragments of truth, each tinted with suspicion. A clerk claimed he had heard footsteps in the hall at midnight, though he could not say whose. A merchant swore he saw a woman's shadow move past the parlor, though none of the female boarders admitted to leaving their rooms. Mrs. Turner herself appeared distraught, insisting that Wallace was quiet and well-liked. But Allan, ever alert, noticed her hesitation when asked about Wallace's visitors. Through persistent inquiry, Allan learned that Wallace had been corresponding with a partner in St. Louis over a disputed business venture. The letters, which he had often read in the parlor, hinted at quarrels over unpaid debts. Allan suspected these letters were the ones burned in the grate. He set about tracing them, sending word to contacts along the river. Days later, confirmation arrived. Wallace's partner, a man named Jonas Reed, had recently traveled to Chicago. Allan returned to the boarding house with renewed scrutiny. If Reed had come, how had he entered and left without detection? Re-examining the door, Allan observed faint scratches near the keyhole, almost invisible in poor light. They were not the jagged marks of a forced entry but the delicate impressions of a skeleton key. Reed, or an accomplice, had entered with ease. As for the locked door after the murder, Allan reasoned that a string, drawn through the keyhole, could have turned the lock from outside. The final clue lay in the soot upon Wallace's fingers. Among the ashes, Allan recovered a fragment of half-burned paper. Pieced together, it revealed a single phrase, "Payment upon delivery." This, Allan realized, was no ordinary quarrel. Wallace had been involved in transporting stolen goods, likely jewelry or valuable fabrics, and Reed had sought to silence him before exposure. With this conclusion, Allan set a watch upon the city's river docks. Within days, Reed was seen attempting to book passage south. When apprehended, he carried a bundle of false documents and a small fortune in jewelry. Confronted with the evidence, Reed confessed. He had lured Wallace into complicity, then murdered him when betrayal seemed inevitable. The case electrified Chicago. Newspapers praised Pinkerton's diligence, declaring that he had solved a puzzle fit for the great minds of Europe. For Allan, however, the victory was less about fame and more about principle. He reflected that murder was unlike theft or fraud. It was an assault not only upon the individual but upon the peace of all who lived nearby. A man could replace money lost, but a life stolen could never be restored. In his notes, Allan wrote, "The locked door deceives only those who see walls and bolts as barriers. To a criminal, they are but stage curtains, meant to trick the eye." The detective's task is to look beyond the illusion, to see not what appears but what must have been. The murder at Mrs. Turner's boarding house became a turning point in Allan's career. It demonstrated that his methods, observation, patience, and logical deduction, could penetrate mysteries that baffled ordinary officers. It also deepened his conviction that crime, in all its forms, thrived upon secrecy and deception. His duty was to pierce both. As winter yielded to spring, Allan returned to his work with renewed determination. More cases waited, thefts, conspiracies, and plots that would stretch from Chicago's alleys to the corridors of Washington. But he would not forget Henry Wallace, nor the lesson of the locked door. For in that quiet boarding house, with its creaking stairs and narrow halls, Allan Pinkerton had proven that even murder, cloaked in impossibility, could not withstand the steady gaze of truth. Chapter 5: The Secret Societies. By the late 1850s, Allan Pinkerton had earned a reputation not only as a detective of crime but as a guardian of civic order. Yet as Chicago grew, so too did movements that sought to undermine stability. Secret societies, some dedicated to labor reform, others to political causes, began to flourish in back rooms and cellar halls. Not all were criminal, but within their shadows dangerous men plotted acts of violence. To most, these organizations were whispers, seen in coded pamphlets, heard in tavern rumors, but to Allan they were storms gathering beneath calm skies. The city council, fearing unrest, turned to Pinkerton to investigate. Reports spoke of a group styling themselves the Sons of Liberty. Cloaked in rhetoric of justice, they met at night, swore oaths of silence, and plotted to disrupt businesses that refused their demands. Merchants complained of threats scrawled upon their doors, workers vanished after speaking against the group, and warehouses mysteriously burned when owners defied extortion. Chicago police could not penetrate the society, for their agents were too well known. Pinkerton, however, possessed a different tool: disguise. Allan believed infiltration was the key. He selected two operatives, James McParland, a wiry man with a gift for mimicry, and Kate Warren, his trusted female detective whose quick wit and calm presence had already proven invaluable. McParland posed as a disaffected laborer, drifting from job to job, spreading quiet discontent. Kate, adopting the guise of a widow seeking protection, insinuated herself among women sympathetic to the group. Together they wove their way toward the society's inner circle. For weeks Allan received nightly reports in his office, each detail carefully recorded. The Sons of Liberty, he learned, met in a dingy hall above a warehouse near the river. Their leader, a man known only as Captain Nolan, preached fiery speeches against merchants and government alike. He promised equality but wielded fear, demanding loyalty sealed by oath. Members were branded with secret signs, gestures exchanged in public markets, and passwords muttered in alleys. The society's true purpose was not reform but profit. Through intimidation, they collected contributions from shopkeepers, lining their pockets under the banner of liberty. The difficulty lay in proof. Threats whispered and oaths sworn left no evidence admissible in court. Allan counseled patience. He instructed McParland to feign greater zeal, to volunteer for tasks that would expose the society's crimes. One night McParland was ordered to assist in setting fire to a warehouse whose owner had refused payment. Feigning obedience, he slipped word to Allan. Before dawn, Pinkerton's men lay in wait. As Nolan and his accomplices approached with oil and tinder, the detective seized them. The surprise was complete, not a match was struck. The arrests shocked the society. Some members fled the city, others dissolved into silence, but Nolan and his lieutenants were tried and convicted of conspiracy and attempted arson. In court Allan testified not only to the planned fire but to the broader threat secret societies posed when left unchecked. The newspapers lauded his victory, declaring, "Pinkerton has struck the mask from false liberty, revealing crime beneath." Yet Allan's battle with secret societies did not end there. Another organization, more insidious, reached beyond Chicago, the Order of the Golden Circle. Ostensibly a fraternal lodge, its members harbored sympathies for Southern secession and plotted to sow discord in northern states. They whispered of forming a Golden Empire stretching into Mexico and the Caribbean. While many treated them as eccentrics, Allan discerned danger. In an age when the Union itself trembled, conspiracies of such scale could ignite violence. He dispatched agents across Illinois, Indiana, and Ohio, gathering intelligence. What they uncovered was alarming: caches of weapons hidden in barns, meetings held under cover of night, and plans to sabotage railroads carrying federal supplies. Allan presented his findings to state officials, who at first dismissed them as exaggeration. But when several bridges near Indianapolis were discovered weakened by sawed timbers, doubt vanished. The order, though cloaked in ritual and secrecy, had shown its hand. Pinkerton himself traveled to Indianapolis, posing as a businessman sympathetic to Southern grievances. Through calculated conversation, he gained the trust of a recruiter, who brought him to a meeting. Allan sat quietly in a candlelit hall as speeches rang of independence and empire. He noted names, symbols, and codes, committing each to memory. With this knowledge he returned to authorities, urging decisive action. Raids followed, weapons were seized, and several leaders arrested. Though the order did not collapse entirely, its power was broken in the Midwest. The experience taught Allan an enduring lesson: that secrecy was the cloak of both crime and conspiracy. Whether counterfeiters, thieves, or political agitators, all relied upon silence and shadows. A detective's strength lay in piercing those shadows, in making the secret plain. Sunlight, he told his agents, is the enemy of conspiracy. Our duty is to carry the lantern. Not all appreciated his methods. Some accused him of spying upon honest workers, of prying into politics beyond his station. Allan, however, remained firm. He distinguished between lawful assembly and criminal conspiracy, supporting the first and opposing the second. His loyalty, he declared, was not to party or faction but to justice and the safety of society. By the close of the decade, Pinkerton's files bulged with coded documents, sketches of symbols, and transcripts of oaths. He had built a network of operatives capable of entering places no uniformed officer could tread. His agency, though still small, had proven its worth not only against thieves and counterfeiters but against societies that threatened the peace of the nation. In quiet moments, Allan reflected upon the paradox of his work. He, who despised secrecy, relied upon it. He trained men and women to disguise themselves, to wear false names, to speak lies in order to uncover greater truths. It troubled him, yet he justified it by the results: crimes prevented, lives saved, conspiracies broken. In war, he wrote in his notes, a scout wears the enemy's colors to win the day. In justice, we must sometimes do the same. The coming years would test this philosophy more than he could imagine. For as tensions between North and South sharpened, secret societies multiplied. Some plotted rebellion, others assassination. And soon, Allan Pinkerton would find himself thrust into a conspiracy whose outcome might determine the fate of the nation itself. Chapter 6: The Lincoln Conspiracy. In February of 1861, America trembled on the edge of war. Abraham Lincoln, newly elected president, prepared to journey from Springfield, Illinois, to Washington, D.C., for his inauguration. The nation's rails would bear him eastward, carrying not only a man but the fragile hopes of Union itself. Yet in the taverns of Baltimore and the back rooms of Maryland inns, whispers grew of a plot darker than politics. Lincoln was to be assassinated before he ever reached the capital. It was Samuel H. Felton, president of the Philadelphia, Wilmington and Baltimore Railroad, who first approached Allan Pinkerton. Felton's intelligence suggested that secessionist sympathizers planned to strike Lincoln as he passed through Baltimore, a city divided and seething with Southern loyalty. The plan was cunning. Amid the confusion of transferring trains, since tracks did not run directly through the city, assassins would strike Lincoln down in the crowded depot. To Felton, the evidence was grave. To Allan, it was a call he could not ignore. Pinkerton traveled to Baltimore in secrecy, accompanied by several of his most trusted operatives, including Kate Warren. Disguised variously as merchants, travelers, and Southern sympathizers, they immersed themselves in the city's political undercurrent. Baltimore was a tinderbox, its streets echoing with secessionist speeches and its taverns filled with men eager for rebellion. For days the operatives listened, watched, and reported. Slowly, a picture emerged. In smoky back rooms, groups plotted Lincoln's death with chilling precision. One plan spoke of stabbing him as he left his carriage, another of shooting him amid the press of the crowd. The common thread was Baltimore. There, the president-elect would be most vulnerable. Allan himself, posing as a Southern businessman, attended meetings where fiery men denounced Lincoln as a tyrant and vowed he would never reach Washington alive. Their words, though wrapped in bravado, carried deadly intent. Pinkerton compiled the intelligence, recording names, dates, and methods. He grew convinced the conspiracy was real and imminent. Yet convincing Lincoln and his advisers proved difficult. When Allan met with Norman Judd, a close associate of Lincoln, the lawyer listened with skepticism. The president-elect, Judd insisted, must not cower before rumor. To alter his journey would appear cowardly. Allan pressed firmly, describing in detail the men he had seen, the weapons purchased, the coded signals prepared. Still, Judd hesitated. It was Kate Warren who tipped the scale. In her guise as a sympathetic Southern lady, she had won confidences denied to men. She reported that conspirators planned to infiltrate the depot crowd, ensuring that when Lincoln appeared, confusion would cloak the assassin's hand. There will be a rush, she told Allan, a pushing, as though from excitement. In that crush the deed will be done. Her report, combined with Allan's evidence, at last convinced Judd. The danger could no longer be dismissed. A plan was devised. Lincoln would travel openly as far as Philadelphia, fulfilling scheduled appearances. But from there, under cover of night, he would journey in secret through Baltimore, disguised and accompanied by Pinkerton operatives. It was a plan of deception, a cloak to preserve the life of a man destined for history. On the evening of February 22, in Philadelphia, Lincoln raised a flag above Independence Hall. To the public, it appeared he would continue as planned. But that night, after a public dinner, he slipped away quietly. Pinkerton had arranged every detail, a special train, secured carriages, and operatives positioned along the route. Lincoln, tall and unmistakable, donned a soft felt cap and a shawl, altering his appearance enough to pass as an ordinary traveler. Kate Warren accompanied him, playing the role of a sister attending her invalid brother. The journey was tense. At every station, Allan's operatives watched for suspicious movements. Telegraph lines were cut to prevent word of the change from spreading. In Baltimore, while crowds waited for a man who never arrived, Pinkerton guided Lincoln swiftly and silently through the city. By dawn of February 23, the president-elect arrived safely in Washington, his life preserved by secrecy and speed. The public reaction was mixed. Some newspapers mocked the president for traveling in disguise, painting him as timid. Others praised his prudence. Lincoln himself, though uncomfortable with the subterfuge, later admitted that caution had likely saved his life. For Pinkerton, the ridicule mattered little. He knew the danger had been real, the conspiracy genuine. In his own memoir he wrote, had he passed as planned, the knife would have struck before he spoke his first word as president. The affair marked a turning point in Pinkerton's career. He had not merely solved a crime but prevented one of immeasurable consequence. The life of Abraham Lincoln, and perhaps the survival of the Union, had hung upon his judgment. His agency, still young, now stood at the forefront of national security. Allan reflected often upon those tense nights. He knew critics would scoff at secrecy and disguise, yet he believed firmly that the detective's first duty was preservation of life. To expose Lincoln to risk for the sake of appearances would have been folly. In later years, as war raged and conspiracies multiplied, he returned to this lesson, that truth was often guarded not by force of arms but by the quiet work of those unseen. In his office after the inauguration, Allan addressed his operatives. "What we have done," he told them, "will not be celebrated in song nor praised in public halls. But history will remember that in Baltimore we carried a man through darkness, and with him the hopes of millions." The conspiracy of 1861 did not end with Baltimore. More plots would follow, some foiled, some deadly. But in that first great test, Allan Pinkerton and his agency had proven their worth. They had faced secrecy with secrecy, deception with deception, and in doing so had preserved a life upon which the future of a nation rested. Chapter 7: The Agents in the Shadows. The Baltimore affair had changed everything. Allan Pinkerton, once a cooper and then a detective of local repute, now stood as the man who had preserved Abraham Lincoln's life. His agency, still young, suddenly found itself thrust into matters of national consequence. With the outbreak of the Civil War in 1861, demand for his skills multiplied. Railroads, banks, and government offices clamored for protection. But more than protection, the Union needed intelligence. In a conflict where armies stretched across miles and loyalties shifted like sand, information became as valuable as bullets. Pinkerton rose to the challenge. His agency expanded, recruiting operatives from all walks of life, former policemen, clerks, laborers, even actors. Yet what set his agency apart was his willingness to see talent beyond convention. He believed that courage, intelligence, and discretion mattered more than muscle. Thus he continued to employ women as detectives, an innovation that startled many in his age. To Allan, however, their presence was indispensable. Women could move where men aroused suspicion, listening where men were silenced. Among his operatives, none was more trusted than Kate Warren. Since her daring work in Baltimore, she had proven herself invaluable. Under various disguises, widow, Southern belle, loyal servant, she gathered intelligence from places close to men. Pinkerton often remarked that Kate possessed a calm boldness rare even among seasoned detectives. Together with her and others, he built what he called his shadow force, a network of unseen watchers who carried his lantern into the darkest corners of war and crime. The agency's motto, "We never sleep," symbolized by the unblinking eye upon their emblem, captured the essence of their work. To the public it was a curiosity, to criminals, a warning. But within the agency it was more than motto, it was creed. Allan expected diligence without pause, vigilance without slumber. He demanded meticulous reports, precise detail, and absolute loyalty. Agents who failed to meet his standard were dismissed without hesitation. To those who succeeded, however, he offered respect, trust, and the pride of serving justice. One of the agency's early wartime tasks was guarding the railroads that carried Union supplies. Saboteurs lurked in woods, plotting to derail trains and sever lines of communication. Pinkerton deployed agents along critical routes, disguised as laborers and track walkers. They uncovered plots before they bloomed, dismantled cells of Confederate sympathizers, and ensured that the arteries of war remained unbroken. In many cases, their vigilance prevented disasters the public never knew had been imminent. But it was in the realm of espionage that Pinkerton's shadows truly proved their worth. Commissioned by General George McClellan, Allan was tasked with gathering intelligence on Confederate forces. His men slipped across lines, counting regiments, sketching fortifications, and intercepting messages. Though later historians debated the accuracy of some of these reports, there was no denying the bravery of the agents who risked capture and death. For Pinkerton, the very act of sending ordinary men and women into danger for the cause of Union was proof of the detective's higher duty. Not all operations succeeded without loss. On more than one occasion, agents disappeared, swallowed by the vastness of war. Their fates were often grim, execution as spies, or confinement in brutal prisons. Allan mourned each loss deeply, though he rarely showed it in public. In his private notes he wrote, "They walk in shadows, bearing the lantern of truth, yet the shadows sometimes claim them. Their names may be forgotten by history, but not by me." Outside the theater of war, the agency continued to tackle cases of crime that threatened commerce. Banks entrusted their transfers of gold to Pinkerton guards, whose watchful presence discouraged even the boldest robbers. Express companies relied on his men to escort valuables across dangerous terrain. On more than one occasion, attempted robberies were foiled not by gunfire but by the mere reputation of Pinkerton's never-sleeping eye. Allan also understood the power of system. He insisted his agents maintain detailed records, creating one of the earliest centralized criminal files in America. Names, aliases, physical descriptions, habits, associates, every scrap of information was catalogued. In time, these files became invaluable, allowing operatives to identify repeat offenders and track criminals across state lines. What seemed tedious at first revealed itself as revolutionary, a scientific approach to detection in a land where law often remained crude. The agency's success bred both admiration and resentment. Some praised Pinkerton as a patriot and guardian of law, others accused him of wielding too much power. His secrecy, his reach across state lines, and his reliance on disguise unsettled those who valued transparency. Yet Allan remained steadfast. A detective, he declared, must walk unseen if he is to serve the scene. The law is daylight, but we must be its shadows. One case from this period illustrated both the daring and the danger of his methods. A plot had been uncovered to rob a bank in Cincinnati, orchestrated by a gang that had already escaped justice in 3 states. Pinkerton dispatched operatives to pose as drifters, mingling with the gang in taverns. After weeks of feigned camaraderie, the agents gained the robbers' trust, learning of their plan to tunnel beneath the bank's cellar. On the eve of the attempt, Pinkerton's men, joined by local police, seized the gang inside their own tunnel. The robbers, stunned, were dragged into daylight like rats from a burrow. The case made headlines across the Midwest, further enhancing the agency's mystique. Yet Allan knew the work of shadows was not glamorous. It demanded sacrifice, long nights, lonely disguises, constant suspicion. He himself endured fatigue, his health often strained by endless travel and ceaseless responsibility. Still he pressed onward, driven by belief that justice required vigilance. He often reminded his agents of their higher purpose: you are not merely detectives. You are guardians of order, the unseen hand that keeps chaos at bay. By the war's midpoint, the Pinkerton Agency was more than a company, it was an institution. With operatives stationed across states, with files thicker each month, with its eye emblazoned upon the public imagination, it had become a force criminals feared and authorities relied upon. And at its helm stood Allan Pinkerton, stern, plain-spoken, uncompromising. He had shaped an army of shadows, bound not by uniforms but by loyalty to truth. Still, Allan sensed that his greatest challenge was yet to come. The war raged, conspiracies multiplied, and dangers grew more complex. To face them, the lantern must burn brighter, the shadows grow deeper. And so, with his agents at his side, Allan Pinkerton prepared for the next chapter of his life's work, aware that though he might walk in shadows, history's gaze was never far behind. Chapter 8, Legacy of the Watchman. By the time the Civil War drew to a close, Allan Pinkerton had walked a long road from the weaving sheds of Glasgow to the highest councils of America. He had guarded railroads, unmasked counterfeiters, thwarted conspiracies, and carried Abraham Lincoln safely through Baltimore's shadows. His agency, once a modest circle of a few operatives, had grown into a far-reaching organization whose emblem, the unblinking eye and the motto "We never sleep," was recognized across the continent. Yet for Allan, the measure of success was not fame nor profit but the quiet assurance that his watch had preserved order where disorder threatened. In the years after the war, the nation entered a turbulent period of reconstruction. Railroads expanded farther west, banks multiplied, and industries rose with iron and smoke. Crime adapted swiftly, growing more organized, more daring. Train robberies, stagecoach holdups, and elaborate frauds became the scourge of commerce. Where sheriffs lacked men and marshals lacked reach, Pinkerton's agency was summoned. His operatives pursued outlaws across plains and mountains, following trails that lawmen abandoned. Often they succeeded, sometimes they failed, but always they pressed onward, for the name Pinkerton itself had become a warning to criminals: the shadows are watching. Among the most famous pursuits of this era was the relentless hunt for the Reno Gang, notorious for the first train robbery in American history. Pinkerton agents tracked them across states, infiltrated their ranks, and brought many to justice. Later came the pursuit of Jesse James and the James Younger Gang, whose daring raids captured public imagination. Though James himself eluded capture during Allan's lifetime, the agency's dogged pursuit weakened his band and forced him into ever more desperate hiding. Pinkerton himself, scarred by an injury in this campaign, bore the mark of the struggle upon his body until his death. Yet Allan's legacy was not built solely upon dramatic arrests. It lay in the methods he forged and the philosophy he carried. He believed investigation must rest upon discipline, patience, and record. His insistence on detailed files created one of the first organized criminal databases in the world. He established systematic surveillance, undercover infiltration, and the use of female operatives, practices revolutionary in his time, common in ours. He proved that detection was not luck or accident but a craft, a science that could be taught, practiced, and perfected. His devotion to secrecy, however, earned criticism. Some accused his agency of overreach, of meddling in politics or suppressing labor strikes at the behest of powerful employers. Allan defended his choices, insisting that his duty was to preserve order and protect property. Yet he acknowledged the peril of power wielded without conscience. "The lantern," he wrote, "must shine for justice, not for tyranny. If it blinds itself to the weak, it ceases to be light and becomes darkness." These words, though not always heeded by successors, revealed the moral compass Allan sought to maintain. In his personal life, Allan remained the same plain, stubborn Scotsman he had always been. He dressed modestly, spoke directly, and valued honesty above flattery. He loved his wife Joan and their children deeply, though his work often kept him from home. In rare quiet evenings, he found comfort in family and in the memory of Scotland, whose hills and rivers he never forgot. To his sons, who later carried on the agency, he passed not only a business but a creed: vigilance, truth, and perseverance. Allan Pinkerton died in 1884 at the age of 65. By then, his agency had become a national institution, with offices in major cities and operatives scattered across the continent. His passing was mourned not only in Chicago but in Washington and New York, in railroad offices and courthouse halls. Newspapers hailed him as the father of American detection, the man who made law visible where once it had been blind. To many, he was the watchman who had never slept, the sentinel who had stood guard through an age of upheaval. But legacy is measured not only by deeds but by their echo. The methods Allan pioneered shaped the course of modern policing. His emphasis on undercover work influenced law enforcement for generations. His files foreshadowed the centralized records of the FBI. His belief that women could serve as capable detectives broke barriers that would only much later be widely recognized. And his insistence upon principle, that crime was not merely theft but injury to the whole of society, remains a cornerstone of justice. In later years, stories of Allan Pinkerton blurred into legend. Some tales exaggerated, others simplified, yet beneath them all lay the core of truth: a man of iron will who devoted his life to unmasking deception. He was not flawless, his judgment sometimes erred, his method sometimes provoked debate, but his sincerity was never doubted. He lived not for applause but for the steady conviction that order must be defended. Today, when detectives sift through records, when agents work in disguise, when investigators preserve every scrap of evidence, they walk paths first blazed by Pinkerton. His lantern, lit in the forests of Illinois when he stumbled upon counterfeiters, still casts light across the practice of detection. His motto, "We never sleep," endures as a reminder that vigilance is the price of peace. If Allan Pinkerton could have written his own epitaph, it might have been simple: "Here lies a watchman." He kept his post. For in the end, that was his life's work. To watch. To guard. To see through the lies that men spun, and to stand, unwavering, between society and those who would tear it apart. His name endures not only upon agency doors but upon the very fabric of American justice. Thus the story of Allan Pinkerton closes not in the darkness of conspiracy nor in the clash of gunfire, but in the enduring light of legacy. He was the detective who rose from poverty to prominence, who turned chance into calling, who built an empire of vigilance from shadows and resolve. His life was proof that one man's watchfulness could change the course of history. And so, as long as detectives walk unseen, following trails of deceit with patience and courage, Allan Pinkerton, the eternal watchman, lives on.